Yo, what's up, you crazy hot dogs? Have y'all ever heard of these things called special access programs? If you look at something like the Manhattan Project, the people working on various aspects of that project were never told what the project was actually for. They never knew the full picture, and they didn't even know what the person next to them was working on. Well, sometimes I feel like after or around World War II, the world got plunged into a sort of simulation. And it's hard to put my finger on exactly why I feel that way. But sometimes when I really start to think about it, or I stumble across a piece of information, it starts to click into place, and my suspicions become ever more confirmed. You might ask yourself, who controls these compartmented programs? I mean, there has to be some kind of oversight, right? Well, no. A president can't find out what the compartmented programs are about. And even the elected representatives who sign off on the funding for some of these projects have no idea what they're actually about. Well, that becomes a little weird then, doesn't it? Because if the public has no way to influence the nature of these programs, then these programs exist entirely independently of what a population wants. Do you think that the director or key people in these intelligence agencies throughout the world are the ones who come up with these compartmented programs and who decide whether or not they're going ahead? No. Maybe to some degree they can influence whether or not they happen, but they're not at the top. And that's when it starts to get really weird. The more and more I look into it, the more it starts to appear that there's a sort of transnational body, neither private sector nor public sector, but a little bit of both, loyal to no nation, but in control of many, that decides what these programs consist of. And that's when it gets scary. That's when it gets really scary. Tell me if this story sounds familiar. It's several years ago. Some buildings in your country are attacked by men belonging to an Eastern religion. Their mastermind is a man with connections to Saudi Arabia. And the event is so upsetting and kills so many of your fellow citizens that you and everyone else around you support going to war to get revenge. Do you think I'm talking about 9/11? I'm not. Just a few years before we had our thing, Russia had its thing. See, these apartment buildings started getting bombed, and supposedly the mastermind was this guy named Ibn Khattab, and supposedly the perpetrators were these Muslim fanatics. Only a few things along the way would occur that put the entire official narrative into doubt. Sound familiar? Not long after a slightly younger Vladimir Putin had given a speech about how Russia was going to get its revenge against the perpetrators of these horrible attacks, someone noticed a vehicle pull up to an apartment building, and they saw these men getting out of the vehicle and carrying sacks into the apartment building and behaving suspiciously. So they did what most of us would probably do. They called the police, and initially when the police showed up, it was openly stated that they had arrested several men who were carrying sacks full of explosives into the basement of an apartment building. And then it got weirder. It turns out that the men that they arrested were FSB. And that same day, the head of the FSB gave a public statement saying that there were, in fact, no explosives in those sacks, and that the sacks were actually just filled with sugar, and that it was nothing but a drill. Huh, never heard that before. And I wonder what would have happened in that drill if nobody had noticed those men carrying those sugar-filled sacks into that apartment building. Would it still be standing today? And just like with the official narrative surrounding what occurred in New York City and elsewhere 20 years ago, there are things with this event that don't add up, and that when closely scrutinized seem to indicate very clearly that the official narrative is at the very least partly fabricated or skewed to fit a certain agenda. I sometimes feel like after or right around World War II, a sort of simulation was launched in the West, or even all over the world, and we all entered a sort of dream. Officially, 2 world wars were waged so that we could all maintain being free, and the good guys won and the villains were vanquished. Only since then, the direction that things have been going in has been getting darker and darker. openly acknowledged state-sponsored terrorism, an end to rights of privacy and due process, non-stop, never-ending wars constructed entirely on lies, a press that works its hardest to demoralize us, to promote things that harm us or divide us, and politicians who do little more than serve the status quo. And those of you who've dared to think along these lines, or even try communicating what you've learned, are undoubtedly very familiar with what I'm about to talk about. There is a sort of wall that protects the people at the top from the rest of us, and it is a multifaceted and highly complex construct, and it serves its purpose extraordinarily well. One of the key methods is through education. Many of the best and brightest in a given population are conditioned to believe that they have the best chance for a good future through higher education. What this really means, for the most part, is that they pay for the opportunity to be indoctrinated. It's absolutely amazing to me that the same people who will scoff at you when you tell them about the nature of Agenda 21 or about events like the attack on the USS Liberty in 1967 will have no problem entertaining ideas about the creation, the arbitrary creation of a multitude of genders. The same people who tell you about things like white privilege are shocked when you try to discuss with them the nature of the people who control our banks. The same people that will tell you that the Vietnam War was horrid will refuse to listen to you when you tell them the names behind that war. Those same people will refuse to listen to you when you tell them about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, or Operation Northwoods, or how the Project for a New American Century put out a paper stating that they needed an event just like 9/11 to occur before that event happened. The same people who will tell you that Hollywood is dominated by sexist men will be upset when you start to notice patterns about those men in Hollywood. But I digress. Anyone who's dived into a lot of World War II and post-World War II history knows that there is an emphasis by some researchers on the style of education that took place in Axis countries leading up to and during the war. Being that both Germany and Japan recognized that the children of 1935 or of 1938 were going to be the soldiers of 1940 and 1942, a systematic emphasis on certain values and norms, a certain type of conditioning took place in these countries. A physically healthy lifestyle, duty to nation, and various things, both good and bad, were emphasized by the educational systems in these countries. And various historians and academics and all sorts of people have written about how the ideas taught to those children led to fascism, and how those ideas are dangerous, and therefore we must not only not teach those ideas, but we must in fact teach the exact opposite type of thinking. And everybody sat back and patted themselves on the back for being so smart and big-brained. Only, and it never dawns on these people, that the education system has done nothing more but tighten its grip around populations since then. And just because we're not teaching upcoming generations of students about nationalism or traditional values or an interest in patriotism or whatever, doesn't mean that we're not gearing up our future generations for something quite big. It isn't that we're training future generations for a great conflict along the lines of what Germany and Japan were getting ready for, but instead, we're creating degenerate, selfish, stupid, blind, confused creatures. And perhaps that is a great indicator of what they have planned for us. For years, I tried to share what I had learned and come to accept about the nature of our system with those that I care about. I would try to discuss things such as depopulation, rewilding, Agenda 21, and much more. And if I was so lucky that they didn't immediately dismiss what I was trying to tell them, then the next thing was for them to call it a conspiracy theory, and so on and so on and so on. And the end result was always the same. The people I cared about the most were never going to look into it for themselves, and they were never going to believe me. My thing had always been, there's going to come a point where we can't afford to not know this information, because ignorance of it will eventually lead to us blindly walking into a trap. I know I'm not the only one with family and loved ones that won't listen. Try not to give up hope just yet. Thanks a lot for watching this, you crazy old hot dogs. I hope you liked it. You think I'm onto something with all this, or you think I'm way off base here? Let me know down in the comments section, homies. And hey, I only recently set up a Patreon, and I only recently broke over 2,000 subscribers. I know these aren't big boy numbers, but the small number of people who decided to become patrons, as well as all of you subscribers, it means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot, everybody.